Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going on a journey back to the Middle Ages, to medieval Syria.
A fascinating time and place, that's for sure.
It definitely is. We've got Crusaders, powerful empires clashing, the whole deal. But in the midst of all that turmoil, tucked away in the mountains, there's this really interesting group flourishing, the Ismailis.
Yeah, the Ismailis. Their story is one that I think often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
But it's crucial for understanding the complexities of the medieval Middle East.
Absolutely. And that's why we're diving into this fantastic article by Farhad Daftary and Azim Nanji.
The Ismailis and their role in the history of medieval Syria and the Near East. A classic.
It is, and it really sheds light on how this group, a branch of Shia Islam, navigated this incredibly complex world. They weren't just surviving, they were building, they were shaping events.
Leaving their mark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, ready to explore their world? Mountain fortresses, secret networks, some seriously impressive political maneuvering. We're covering it all.
Let's dive in.
All right, let's set the stage. We're starting in 9th century Syria.
A time of, shall we say, some instability.
Definitely. The early Ismaili imams were living in secrecy, always looking over their shoulder, facing potential persecution.
And to organize themselves, to spread their message in this kind of environment, they developed a pretty incredible network.
The Dawah.
Right. The Dawah. Think of it as this blend of scholars, diplomats, even community organizers all working together.
All with this common goal to strengthen the community.
Not just about converting people, but about nurturing knowledge, ethics, building a solid social structure.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it that they could build this intellectual infrastructure under those circumstances. And that foundation proved essential for what came next, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The Dawah played a huge role in the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate, which started in Egypt in 969 CE.
And this wasn't just any empire. The Fatimids, they turned Cairo into a global powerhouse. I mean, we're talking trade, scholarship.
Rivaling any of the great intellectual hubs of the world at that time.
And they really put their money where their mouth was, right? In 970 CE, they founded Al-Azhar University.
Now, picture this. Much of Europe is still struggling with basic literacy. And here are the Fatimids, establishing a university that's going to become one of the oldest, most prestigious in the world, attracting these brilliant minds from all over.
A real melting pot of ideas. I came across this account from a Persian traveler, Nasiri Khusraw, who visited Cairo in 1047.
Oh yeah, Nasiri Khusraw, he had some things to say about Cairo.
He did. He was blown away by the wealth, by the security he saw, said he witnessed such personal wealth that, and I quote, people of Persia would never believe it.
He wasn't exaggerating either. Cairo, under the Fatimids, was incredibly prosperous.
He even described shops that weren't locked, just covered with nets at night. That's some serious trust in your fellow citizens.
It really speaks to the stability, the flourishing culture that the Fatimids created.
A golden age in many ways. But, history rarely stands still, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't.
As the Fatimid era came to a close, the Ismailis in Syria faced a whole new set of challenges.
New players on the board.
In the late 11th century, a Hassani Saba came onto the scene in Iran and established an Ismaili state. This had a ripple effect all the way over to Syria.
And Syria itself was already dealing with its own issues.
Right. Political fragmentation.
The arrival of the Crusaders. Not exactly a recipe for peace and quiet.
No, not at all. It was a time of huge upheaval. Syria was like this patchwork of competing powers.
A real pressure cooker. And for the Ismailis, this meant adapting their strategies to survive.
And that's where those fortresses come in, right?
Yeah, got it. Faced with all these threats, they start creating these fortified centers, strategically placed in the mountains.
In the Jabal Bahra.
Also known as the Jabal in Syria. It's rugged terrain, naturally defensible, perfect for holding out against enemies.
It's interesting, though, their first attempt at establishing a base wasn't actually in the mountains.
No.
It was in Aleppo in the early 12th century.
Aleppo. They had the support of the city's ruler, Ridwan, at the time.
They did, but that alliance didn't last, did it? After Ridwan's death, his successor decided the Ismailis were no longer welcome, expelled them from Aleppo.
Resilience, though, right?
Yeah, didn't let it stop them. They shifted their focus south. But then there was a tragic event in Damascus in 1129.
The massacre, you mean?
Yeah, a massacre of Ismailis in the city. It was a brutal reminder of how vulnerable they were, especially in urban areas.
It underscored the need for a truly defensible base, somewhere they could really dig in and hold out.
And that led them to the Jabal Bahra.
Right. already had existing Ismaili communities there, so it made sense strategically.
In 1132, they purchased their first fortress in the region, Qadmis, from a local warlord.
A smart move, working with what's already there.
But that was just the beginning. In 1140, they capture this fortress called Masyaf, and it becomes their headquarters. Masyaf. And they go on to establish this whole network of fortresses across the Jabal Bahra. It becomes known as the Qila al-Dawa.
Impressive. I mean, these weren't just military outposts. They were, well, centers of life.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What was life actually like in these fortresses? I mean, we're talking about people living, working, raising families, all within these walls. Was it all about just survival?
It was definitely challenging, but there was more to it than that.
I bet those winters were rough.
You could say that again, but alongside the day-to-day reality.
The constant threat of attack.
Right, always being on guard.
Sure.
There was also a thriving culture, based on what we know from historical accounts and archaeology.
Okay, tell me more. Paint me a picture.
So, you've got the military training, the constant vigilance, but also intellectual pursuits, study, discussions. It was a tough environment, but a vibrant one, too.
It really challenges that stereotypical image of medieval fortresses as these gloomy, militaristic places, doesn't it?
It does. And,
Yeah.
you know, we really need to address some of the myths about the Ismailis, especially the ones that have been popularized in the West.
You mean like those stories about the old man of the mountain?
Exactly. Marco Polo and all that. Entertaining tales, sure, but very misleading.
Scholarly work has shown they're just not accurate.
Right. They misrepresent who the Ismailis were, their commitment to knowledge, their ethics.
Their story is far more nuanced than those simplified portrayals would have you believe.
Way more interesting, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And speaking of interesting, we've got to talk about one of the most famous Ismaili leaders, Rashid al-Din Sinan.
Oh, Sinan. He's a fascinating figure. Assumed leadership in Syria in 1162.
A brilliant strategist, master of politics, and by all accounts, a deeply learned man.
He had to be, to navigate the political landscape of that time. You've got the internal Ismaili affairs, then the Ayyubids under Salah al-Din.
And let's not forget the Crusader forces.
Right. It was like a three-dimensional chess match, constantly shifting alliances and rivalries.
So how did Sinan handle all that?
He starts by consolidating the Ismaili presence in Syria, rebuilding, fortifying strongholds. He even manages to secure a period of peace with the Crusaders, although that was always a bit fragile, especially with groups like the Hospitallers who, well, weren't exactly fans of the Ismailis.
To put it mildly.
Sinan, though, he was a skilled diplomat, a strategist, and he led the Syrian Ismailis to a position of power and independence they hadn't really experienced before.
And that's where we'll leave it for today. Join us next time as we delve deeper into the world of the Ismailis, exploring their intellectual traditions and their complex relationship with the Ayyubids.
So last time, we left off with Rashid al-Din Sinan, this brilliant Ismaili leader, really bringing them to a position of power and independence in Syria.
Yeah, Sinan. He was quite the character. But before we go deeper into his story, I think we need to back up a bit.
Back up.
Yeah, I think we need to talk about what makes the Ismailis unique within the larger Islamic world. What are their core beliefs? We mentioned they're Shia Muslims.
Right, part of the Shia branch of Islam, which basically means they believe the leadership of the Muslim community should have passed down through the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, specifically through his cousin and son-in-law, Ali.
Okay, so that's Shia Islam in a nutshell. But there are a lot of different Shia groups, right?
Oh, tons.
What sets the Ismailis apart?
Well, the Ismailis, they trace their lineage back to a specific imam, Imam Ismail. He was the designated successor to his father, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. That's actually where the name Ismaili comes from.
Ah, makes sense. So, like many other Shia groups, they have this concept of imams, these divinely appointed leaders who guide the community.
Exactly. The imam is essential, not just a figurehead. For the Ismailis, the imam is crucial for interpreting the Quran, for guiding the community in all matters of faith and practice.
So in that sense, they're similar to other Shia groups.
In that sense, yes. But there's another layer here, really important one for understanding the Ismailis.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The Ismailis place a strong emphasis on what we call the esoteric, the inner meaning of the Quran. They believe there's this deeper, hidden layer of knowledge that can only be accessed through spiritual guidance, through interpretation.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about reading the Quran literally, it's about uncovering those deeper layers of meaning.
That's exactly it. It's a very intellectual, philosophical approach to religion, And it's one of the things that really sets them apart.
It definitely adds a whole other dimension, doesn't it?
It does. And this intellectualism, this focus on reason and interpretation, is really reflected in their history, too. We've already talked about their patronage of scholarship.
The Fatimids and Al-Azhar.
Right, Al-Azhar. That wasn't just some coincidence. This commitment to learning, to critical thinking. It wasn't just a hobby. It was core to who they were.
Their actions were totally in line with their beliefs. They walk the walk.
That's a great way to put it. They don't just talk about knowledge. They actively pursue it. They create the systems to support it. And it's really remarkable when you consider the context.
Speaking of context, we've talked a lot about the Fatimid Caliphate, but I'm curious about their influence in Syria specifically.
Ah, yes. Syria.
They weren't just ruling in Egypt, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Their influence extended well beyond Egypt's borders. The Fatimid Caliphate had a significant presence in Syria, and a lot of the early Ismaili communities there actually took root during that time.
But things weren't exactly peaceful in Syria, were they?
Peaceful. In medieval Syria.
We talked about political fragmentation, the Crusader invasions. It seems like the Ismailis were constantly caught in the crossfire.
It was a tough neighborhood, that's for sure.
How did they navigate that? I mean, was it just constant struggle?
It was a constant balancing act. They had to be smart about where they settled, who they made alliances with. And that's where those mountain fortresses...
Those really come into play.
Exactly. They offered protection, of course. But they were also these spaces where Ismaili communities could practice their faith, could live with a certain degree of freedom.
So they created these pockets of stability amidst all the chaos around them.
Exactly. It was about carving out space, about maintaining their way of life. And that meant playing the game strategically. Sometimes they'd forge alliances with Muslim rulers.
Sometimes with Crusader forces.
Sometimes. Other times they'd clash. And sometimes they'd just try to stay out of the fray altogether.
It sounds exhausting.
It probably was.
Yeah.
But it highlights their resilience, their political savvy. They knew how to adapt.
And that's where a leader like Rashid al-Din Sinan comes in, right?
Sinan really understood the situation. He knew that survival wasn't just about military strength. It was about building relationships, about maintaining this really delicate balance of power.
You mentioned Sinan's relationship with Salah al-Din, the famous Ayyubid ruler. Now, weren't they rivals at some point?
Their relationship was complicated, let's say. Initially, there was a lot of tension. Salah al-Din even besieged Masyaf. Remember, that's the main Ismaili stronghold in Syria. He besieged it in 1175.
Wow, so things really escalated.
They did. But eventually, both sides realized it was in their best interest to find some kind of common ground.
So pragmatism won out, even in the midst of all this religious and political conflict.
Both Sinan and Salah al-Din were pragmatic guys. They understood that constant warfare would just weaken everyone, especially with the Crusaders still a major threat.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Something like that. They may not have been buddies, but this uneasy alliance. It allowed the Ismailis to maintain a degree of autonomy in Syria for a few more decades.
Seems like a pretty good deal, all things considered.
It was. But, as you know, nothing lasts forever.
What happened? What finally led to the decline of their independence? Was it a clash with Salah al-Din's successors?
The Ayyubids were always a challenge. But the real turning point was the Mongol conquests.
Oh, right, the Mongol.
Devastating. The destruction of the Ismaili state in Iran in 1256, that was a huge blow, not just militarily but symbolically. It deprived the Syrian Ismailis of their main source of support, of guidance.
Like losing their home base.
Exactly. And then, of course, the rise of the Mamluks really sealed their fate.
The Mamluks, another powerful force to contend with.
The Mamluks were determined to consolidate their control over Syria, and that included those Ismaili territories.
So even though the Ismailis had managed to withstand the Crusaders to deal with the Ayyubids, they couldn't hold out against the Mamluks.
Well, it's important to remember, the Mamluks weren't just about brute force. They were smart. They used diplomacy, intrigue, even economic pressure to get what they wanted.
Playing the long game.
Exactly. And they were good at it. They understood that to truly control a region, they had to dismantle the Ismailis' political and economic independence, and they did that very systematically.
Seems kind of ruthless.
Effective, though.
It is, and it's a reminder that power isn't always about just military might. It's about outmaneuvering your opponents, politically, economically.
The Mamluks were masters of that game.
So it's the end of the road for the Ismailis.
Well, not quite. They lost their political independence, yes, but they didn't vanish. They didn't just give up.
What happened to them?
They adapted, again. found ways to preserve their identity, their community. Even under Mamluk rule. Remember Ibn Battuta, the famous traveler?
Yeah, he got around.
He did. And he mentions the Ismailis in his account of his travels through Syria in the 14th century. They're still there, living in their mountain fortresses, but now as subjects of the Mamluks.
So they found a way to exist within this new reality.
They did. And most importantly, they never abandoned their intellectual pursuits. They continued to value education, to engage in these sophisticated interpretations of their faith. The scholar, Marshall Hodgson, he described the Ismailis as maintaining a high level of intellectual life throughout this period.
Amazing. It's like this thirst for knowledge, this intellectual curiosity was just embedded in who they were, even when everything else was changing around them.
It's inspiring, isn't it? They understood that knowledge, intellectual growth. These weren't just luxuries. They were essential for preserving their identity, their community, in the face of all this adversity.
It makes you think about how easily we take those things for granted. Our access to education, to information.
It does. It's a powerful reminder.
It is. So we've talked a lot about these external forces the Ismailis had to deal with. The Crusaders, the Mongols, the Mamluks. But I'm curious about the internal workings of their community. What was daily life actually like inside those fortresses?
Now that's a question that sparks the imagination. What was it like to live, to breathe, to learn within those walls?
Yeah, it's like we're trying to peek behind the curtain, right?
Yeah.
Get a glimpse of this hidden world, these communities thriving in these incredible landscapes. What do we actually know about daily life in the fortresses?
It's tough. We get these like little snapshots from historical accounts, from archaeology, but there's still a lot we don't know. Still a bit of a mystery.
Okay, well, let's work with what we do know. If we could, hop in a time machine, go back, step inside one of these fortresses, what would we see?
Well, first, imagine waking up.
Yeah.
And the sound you hear is birdsong, echoing through the valleys.
Okay, I can picture that.
You open your eyes.
Yeah.
And you see stone,
And
thick stone walls. Your chamber, maybe a small window looking out.
letting in some light.
Exactly. And depending on the time of year, it could be surprisingly cozy or,
Freezing.
yeah, those mountain winters were no joke.
So, not exactly luxury accommodation.
No, not quite. But hey, at least you've got solid protection from invaders, right?
True, true. Safety first. But what about daily life? Was it all military drills and guard duty, or was there more to it?
It was a mix. You'd have your daily chores, of course, fetching water, tending crops. They had to grow some of their own food within the fortress walls.
Makes sense.
And of course, maintaining those defenses always had to be ready.
Right, that constant threat.
Always there. But
Right.
it wasn't just about survival. It was also about community.
Okay, so there was a sense of normalcy, even amidst all that.
Yeah. You'd have families, kids running around, people sharing meals, telling stories. Life went on, even under those conditions.
We've talked about their reputation for learning, for intellectual pursuits. Did that play a role in daily life?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine it's evening, it's cold outside, maybe there's a fire going in the hearth. A group of people, men and women, young and old, they're gathered in a chamber, listening to a scholar.
Debating some point of philosophy.
Exactly. Or maybe someone's reciting poetry or sharing a story from their travels. It was a way to nourish the mind, even when the world outside felt chaotic.
It's a powerful image. This sense of community, the shared love of learning. Even in those circumstances, it really shows how important those intellectual pursuits were to them.
It wasn't just some abstract thing. It was part of their identity.
Right, they lived it.
They did.
So we've talked about the men,
Yeah.
the women, the scholars.
Yeah.
But what about the kids? What was it like to grow up in one of these mountain fortresses?
Can you imagine? I mean, talk about a unique childhood.
I bet.
You'd grow up learning practical skills, right?
Archery.
Horsemanship, how to defend the fortress.
Pretty essential stuff in that environment.
Right. But you'd also be surrounded by this intellectual atmosphere, listening to those debates and discussions, maybe even starting your own formal studies.
It sounds intense, but also kind of amazing.
It definitely would have shaped you, made you resilient, resourceful, given you a deep appreciation for, well, knowledge, for community.
Qualities that would serve you well no matter where you ended up.
That's true.
Thinking about all this, these details of daily life, it just makes the Ismaili story even more remarkable.
It does, doesn't it?
They weren't just surviving, they were creating, building, even when surrounded by conflict.
And they held on to their values, to their sense of community.
It's a really powerful reminder, I think, that even in the toughest circumstances, even when your world feels small, you can still live a meaningful life, a vibrant life. It's all about what you choose to focus on.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's been incredible exploring the world of the Ismailis in medieval Syria. They were scholars, strategists, survivors, and so much more.
Their story.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history is full of surprises.
That there are these hidden stories waiting to be uncovered.
And that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit, it can shine through.
Well said. Well, that's all the time we have for today. To all our listeners out there, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. If you want to explore further, we've got a fantastic bibliography on our website.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of history.